Some of you reached out with your concerns about stabilizing your shots if you've purchased the Sony a6400 and you are interested in or have purchased the Sigma 16mm or a lens like that, that both the body of the camera and the lens, neither one is stabilized. What do you do, especially if you don't have something like this? We're going on a field trip, so get those permission slips ready. Let's go. What is up, you beautiful humans? Welcome back to the channel. And yes, today we are going to be talking about stabilizing your handheld footage with a camera that does not have in-body image stabilization or a lens that has no stabilization either. We're going to be talking about working in a 24 frame timeline, and we're also going to be talking about 4K footage to preserve that 4K footage, because I'm sure many of you know that yes, you can record in 60 frames and 120 frames, but what if you want to use the camera's ability to record in 4K? Now, I do recommend bumping your 4K up to 30 frames. I often record in 24, but we need those extra frames to help with stabilization in post, because depending on what editor you use, you may have to add warp stabilizer or some stabilization from Final Cut Pro, as I use. However, when you are recording that footage, you need to keep in mind less shake is also going to provide you with less editing effort and less warping of your footage. Now, before we really get into it, if you're sensitive to caffeine and you get the shakes, I might go without that day. Now, we're going to be talking about becoming one with the camera, because as we know, even though, and you need to be holding your camera with both hands, also trying to keep it as close to our body, because as we know, as we get further away from our body, the footage gets shakier and shakier. And especially if we want to record in 4K, remember, 30 frames with the a6400, because that's what that's capable of. If you can film in a higher frame rate at 4K, that's awesome. Now, a couple of things to think about when you are keeping this camera close to your body. One of the breathing techniques that I recommend is that right as you're shooting and moving into the subject, or moving forward or panning left or right, is to breathe out as you're doing it slowly. You want to make these movements slow because, again, at 4K, 30 frames, you have less frames to work with. So do not move fast and expect to get buttery smooth footage in post. Now, some of these techniques might not be good for you based on your build, but we're gonna go through a few that some of you may be able to use. Specifically, I've got this knee to knee motion that I can go back and forth, and I find that I can be pretty stable, especially when I'm low to the ground. I can also do it when I'm standing up, but when I'm low, I can make these shifts, and as I'm making those shifts, I'm breathing out to keep that footage as steady as possible. So bringing the strap into play with this knee to knee, because that's a very hard move, it's gonna actually offer you a little extra stability. So that way you've got this around your neck, and you're not worried about keeping the camera up or down. You just dial it in to the length that you need, and then that way you're just more focused on the side to side movement. All right, so another pretty awkward move here is keeping that strap tight. So again, I realize everybody's necks and backs are probably not gonna support this, but if it can, this is gonna be a nice move out. So just this dolly move, and that way I'm not worried about the shake up and down. I'm still focused on stabilizing it from side to side. So something else that you can stabilize with is something like this, like using your environment. So I could lean against this tree right here and put my elbow up against that and extend out over the water. But what I'm gonna actually do here is I'm gonna put my foot on this tree and then come through the trees. So let's get that set up and see what that looks like. So I'm actually just gonna try to keep the camera close to me, and then as I approach the trees, then I'm gonna extend out so that I have limited shake up until I get out over the water. Getting my second workout. I ended up moving some branches out of the way, so if they come back and smack me into the water, well, at least it's documented. So something else to think about too, as you're extending out, is rotating your camera, because what happens is as that camera leaves your body, so does that stability. And as you're making that turn, some of that will swallow up some of that shake, basically. Now, another technique with the strap is that if we're doing a panning motion around, again, remember for 4K, we want to go slow, but we have the strap tight around our necks, and as we're moving, all we're focused on is this up and down motion, because side to side, we're pretty stable. So just make sure that your footing is stable and you're going slow. And something to keep in mind in your environment is your foreground and your background. Now, with a wide angle lens like the Sigma 16mm, and also the fact that you have an aperture at 1.4. Now, depending on your shooting conditions, because I'm always telling you that be careful that things are not overexposed and you're not completely blown out. But in some situations, looking at your foreground, and I use the rule of thirds, and I put that up on my LCD screen on my camera to see how I can frame up the shot and how I'm using that foreground to help gauge what's happening in the background or with my subject. And I like to use that foreground to get a little bit of that rack focus where it kind of blurs out and then pops on the background or the subject that I'm trying to film. Now, something else that I try to do, and this is certainly something that I recommend being careful, making sure that your environment is safe and that you feel stable, is as I'm holding the camera close to me and doing this falling forward or doing like a fall backward. So if I'm slowing that footage down a little bit, then as I'm falling forward, it's getting tight on that. But obviously I might only have about 2 to 3 seconds tops, depending on how slow I'm going before I actually fall forward. So just catching yourself. So be careful with that one. That's certainly not for everybody, but I like it just to kind of move in on the subject, knowing that it's going to give me that smooth footage at least for a couple of seconds. And then obviously I jut forward and I can't use anything after that. Now, using your environment to hinge off of, like the trees that I was around or anything where I can just lean in and provide my own stabilization as the filmer, as the videographer, and just moving up toward the subject in just a fluid motion, or if I need to get against something and slide back or slide forward, putting my arm on something stable, and I'm using whatever it is that I'm trying to film and using that as stabilization. So again, that just creates less axes that I have to focus on when it comes to that shake. Now, once you have all of the footage and you're bringing it back into post, remember we're talking about a 24 frame timeline here. In Final Cut Pro, DaVinci, Premiere, they all have stabilization built in, but if your camera is shaking, like if you are shaking all over the place, it doesn't matter how good your stabilization is, how good your video editing skills are, especially if you're talking about 4K footage at 30 frames at most, trying to slow it down, because you can slow down 30 frames, I would say no more than 80%, and that's like really pushing it. But 60 frames and 120 frames, yes, you can slow that down quite a bit and still have a lot of the integrity of the file there and the frames. But with 4K footage, it's, you know what, I mean, still, if your footage is shaky, it's going to be hard stabilizing it. So just remember your pre-production, where you're filming and what you may need to film, and then the actual filming process as I had outlined in this tutorial. Now, I've got other videos on this channel talking about camera gear and audio gear to help you level up your creative business, so feel free to go check those out. As always, go out there and do those things that matter. You keep rocking those faces. You go do the things, and I'll be right here creating more content for you. And until then, I appreciate your time and attention, and I'll catch you right back here.